There were certain events in Flaxborough that occurred less because they were necessary than because they were expected. The annual parish aid raffle was one such institution, a gentle exercise in civic virtue disguised as chance. It raised just enough money to justify the effort and provided the town's more conscientious residents an opportunity to look modest while calculating how many tickets they could buy without seeming greedy. Mrs. Felicity Binns, a widow of 2 years' respectable grief, purchased hers from the vicar's wife on a Wednesday afternoon in March. She paid with 2 half-crowns, polished to the degree that suggested careful economy rather than ostentation, and, with a small, deliberate flourish, wrote her name on both stubs. Mrs. Binns had a hand one might describe as disciplined. It had once written minutes for the Women's Institute, and though it had since devoted itself chiefly to correspondence concerning charitable teas, its precision remained. Each Felicity Binns was rendered in neat copper plate, identical to the other, as though signed by a woman quietly sure of her place in things. When, some weeks later, her name was drawn to win first prize, a weekend for 2 in Scarborough, Flaxborough's collective approval was swift, if faintly rehearsed. The vicar's wife expressed delight, she so deserves a change, and Miss Teal, the parish committee secretary, wrote out the winner's notice in her most deferential italic for the church bulletin. Even the Chronicle carried a brief mention, long-time parish worker receives Raffle first prize. It might have ended there, tidily, agreeably, had Miss Teal not mentioned, during the next committee meeting, that 2 tickets appeared to bear the same name. The committee assembled as usual in the church hall, an overlit, overpolished space whose acoustics lent moral gravity to the scraping of chairs. Inspector Purbright was present by invitation to speak, somewhat reluctantly, on pedestrian safety. He had not expected to remain beyond the allotted 15 minutes, but Flaxborough's committees rarely released anyone once they had settled in the satisfaction of their own orderliness. The raffle was reached somewhere between matters arising and any other business. Miss Teal, consulting her ledger with a faint pursing of the lips, announced that there was a small irregularity in the record of last month's draw. The vicar, who had been staring fixedly at the ceiling's electric fittings, looked down with something close to apprehension. "Irregularity, Miss Teal?" "Yes. I noticed, purely by chance of course, that 2 entries bore Mrs. Binns's signature, numbers 47 and 53. There was a silence of polite dismay. Mrs. Binns herself, seated with folded gloves and an expression of gentle distraction, turned slightly in her chair, as though summoned from a reverie about marmalade. "Oh," she said, "I remember now. I must have written both when I thought the first had gone astray. The vicar's wife was so busy that day, I didn't like to trouble her." The vicar's wife murmured something indistinctly generous. Miss Teal, however, persisted with a modest firmness. Both were entered, Mrs. Binns, and both, I regret to say, paid for. "Well," said Mrs. Binns with a calmness that managed to sound faintly regretful toward others' confusion, "then the charity is the better for it." No one could think of a polite objection to this logic. Even Miss Teal, who had that curious appetite for moral symmetry common among those of secret bitterness, relented with an audible exhalation. Purbright, from his corner seat, watched the small drama conclude with professional detachment. It had none of the qualities usually required to interest the police. No theft, no threat, not even a good quarrel. But it held that delicate air of communal unease which in Flaxborough often presaged the slow unfolding of something faintly distasteful. The meeting concluded with tepid tea and seed cake. Mrs. Binns accepted both with the grace of one accustomed to minor victory. Purbright, sipping his tea, observed that she neither blushed nor defended herself. She seemed rather to pity those who thought her behaviour worthy of remark. When the others had begun discussing flower rota logistics, Purbright leaned toward the vicar. "A curious little muddle," he said mildly. The vicar smiled in that exhausted way peculiar to men who have long borne committees as a condition of holy service. "A misunderstanding, I assure you. Mrs. Binns has been a pillar of our fundraising efforts. The woman practically runs the parish by herself." "Indeed," said Purbright. "And how fortunate the parish is to have such steady pillars. I only hope they don't all buy 2 tickets." The vicar's smile dimmed a degree. "We shall make certain of that." It was the following morning when Miss Teal arrived at the police station, bearing a small envelope. Its contents, one faded ticket stub marked number 47, Mrs. Felicity Binns, were laid out upon Purbright's desk like a minor relic. "I thought it best to return it," she said, her tone tremulous with moral urgency, "in case anyone accuses me later of misplacing it. The second stub seems to have gone missing." "Missing?" "Vanished. I looked in the parish drawer myself." Purbright nodded slowly. Perhaps it was used to wrap something up. Miss Teal, whose view of human frailty seldom included such practicalities, frowned. "I don't think so. People don't just mislay things in Flaxborough, Inspector. Not tickets, not when they concern money." She left after making her point, leaving behind a faint scent of lavender that lingered with almost forensic clarity. Purbright examined the ticket again. Its edges were perfectly straight, the handwriting untroubled. There was, he reflected, something about Mrs. Binns's calm acceptance of suspicion that merited further thought. People who feared discovery tended to fluster. Those who did not often had nothing to hide, or had hidden something with professional thoroughness. At luncheon in the station canteen, Purbright mentioned the matter to Sergeant Love, whose appetite for moral complexity was limited but dutiful. "So she bought 2 tickets," Love said between bites. "Hardly a crime, sir." "Quite so," said Purbright. "Still, it's interesting that she didn't deny it until asked, nor apologize once caught, almost as if she thought herself above reproach." Love considered this. Could be she just forgot. Yes, forgetfulness can be a useful virtue. After lunch, Purbright strolled through the high street, his mind moving gently from thought to observation. Flaxborough, in its mid-afternoon serenity, displayed all the outward calm of a town whose inhabitants valued discretion over curiosity. Yet beneath its polished windows and swept pavements, there always lingered that quiet sediment of judgment, a sense that each citizen's conduct was being weighed on some invisible parish scale. He met Mrs. Binns near the post office, parcel in hand. "Good afternoon, Inspector," she said, her tone perfectly courteous. "I hear poor Miss Teal has been quite overwrought by all this ticket nonsense." "Ah," said Purbright, "I understand she has a delicate sense of fairness." Mrs. Binns smiled faintly. "Fairness is a fine thing, though some people prefer to see it where it flatters them best." Purbright inclined his head. A philosophical view. "Experience, Inspector. One learns it in marriage." She moved on, her figure small but precise, leaving the faintest whiff of mothballs and lemon soap. Purbright stood for a moment, then glanced toward the parish notice board. The printed list of raffle winners fluttered faintly in the breeze. The name Mrs. F. Binns appeared twice, once neatly crossed out, as if by a hand eager to amend embarrassment before it was fully noticed. That evening, the Flaxborough Chronicle appeared with its usual brevity of news and excess of moral commentary. Between the report on the council's drainage subcommittee and a congratulatory note to a retired headmistress ran a short paragraph. It was discovered, after last week's draw, that one participant had inadvertently purchased 2 tickets for the parish aid raffle. The matter has now been amicably resolved." Purbright folded the paper carefully. "Amicably resolved," he murmured. In Flaxborough, such phrases usually translated as politely suppressed. He sat late in his office, not because the case required it, but because small puzzles interested him as much for their social echoes as for their facts. A missing ticket, an overeager secretary, a widow who neither flustered nor protested. He found his thoughts returning to Mrs. Binns's remark. One learns fairness in marriage. It suggested, perhaps unintentionally, that she considered herself both student and teacher in that art. He wrote a brief note to Constable Chubb, requesting that he have a look at the Raffle accounts from last year, purely as a matter of interest. Then, folding the single, surviving ticket into an envelope, he placed it in his drawer beside a paperclip and an unused pen nib. As he turned out the lamp, a small draught stirred the edges of the Chronicle still lying on his desk. The article's headline fluttered upward, revealing beneath it a tiny advertisement for a church jumble sale. Among the listed donations was a writing bureau, oak veneer, very good condition. Purbright paused, then smiled faintly to himself. In Flaxborough, one found that the truth rarely shouted. It was usually for sale, quietly, and for a reasonable price. Flaxborough was not a town that forgot. Its memory worked not by record or monument, but by repetition. Small stories, once told, were worn smoother by constant use until their original shape was almost lost, and only a faint gleam of impropriety remained. Thus, when Mrs. Felicity Binns's name appeared twice in the Raffle ledger, the matter entered Flaxborough memory not as scandal, but as material. It was retold in the butcher's, corrected in the post office, and refined in the hairdresser's to something genteel enough for local use. By the end of the week, the consensus was that Mrs. Binns had been a little forgetful, a diagnosis which combined moral forgiveness with social superiority. Mrs. Binns herself maintained an admirable serenity. She continued her rounds, the cooperative, the library, the greengrocer's, with that mild air of preoccupation particular to widows who have achieved comfort without companionship. She nodded to acquaintances and inquired after their relatives with unflagging precision. When she noticed that several of them replied too quickly or too sweetly, she accepted it with the calm of one who had already costed public opinion into her day. Miss Teal, however, did not fare so well. A week after the committee meeting, she developed a cough of uncertain origin and sent her apologies to the parish office until fully recovered. The vicar's wife, whose patience for administrative frailty was limited by her own, sent flowers but no inquiries. By Sunday, Miss Teal's absence was described as indefinite. Inspector Purbright read all this in the subtle signs of omission: chairs left unclaimed, teacups unused, the faint eagerness with which people changed the subject when her name arose. He had, as usual, no official interest in the affair, but a professional curiosity that attached itself to the quieter disorders of moral life. The weather that week encouraged indolence. Mist lay over the high street like a kind of collective hesitation. Purbright, strolling toward the police station after lunch, paused to observe the window of the Flaxborough Chronicle office. Inside, the editor, Mr. Ragg, could be seen leaning back in his chair with the mild satisfaction of one who had recently chosen not to publish something. Purbright entered without knocking. "Good afternoon, Ragg." Ragg looked up with the caution of a man who lives largely by not knowing too much. "Inspector, always a pleasure to see you." "Indeed. That would make you unique in Flaxborough." Ragg smiled thinly. "You'll find most of us are only privately unique." Purbright took the proffered chair. "I was wondering whether your office intends to revisit the matter of the parish raffle." "Ah, the great double entry," Ragg said with mock solemnity. "No, I think that incident has been sufficiently aired. The vicar made it quite clear that Mrs. Binns's duplicate ticket was the result of clerical enthusiasm. That's a novel euphemism. Flaxborough excels at euphemism, Inspector. It keeps us from needing alibis. Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. And how fares Miss Teal? Ragg adjusted a paperweight. Ill. Though illness in her case tends to coincide with embarrassment, the two are practically conjoined. Interesting, said Purbright. Embarrassment can be quite infectious. That evening, in the snug respectability of her sitting room, Mrs. Binns was writing a letter. She used her late husband's fountain pen, a black swan with a faint leak that spotted her fingers in a way she found oddly companionable. The letter, brief and carefully phrased, was addressed to Mrs. C. Vane, Church Treasurer. My dear Mrs. Vane, in light of the recent misunderstanding, I enclose the price of a raffle ticket, which I believe may have been entered in error. Please regard it as an additional contribution to parish funds. Yours sincerely, Felicity Binns. She blotted the note, sealed it, and laid it aside with the air of one completing a small but necessary act of hygiene. Then she rose, switched off the lamp, and stood by the window a moment, looking into the unlit street. The faint figure of Mr. Pargeter, her neighbour, could be seen stooping over his gate, trimming some invisible imperfection in the hedge. His diligence at night had become a feature of local curiosity. Mrs. Binns watched him for a moment longer than she intended, then drew the curtains and went upstairs. The next day, Constable Chubb reported to Inspector Purbright that the Raffles financial ledger contained something odd. Odd? Well, sir, the book shows 2 payments under Mrs. Binns's name, each for 2 and 6pence, but they're entered on different dates and in different inks. One's neat, one's smudged. Which is which? The neat one's earlier, sir, the smudged one's added in the margin. Purbright nodded. A retrospective generosity, perhaps. Chubb frowned, unsure if irony were being attempted. Shall I ask the vicar about it? No, said Purbright. Let the church continue its own bookkeeping. I find divine arithmetic confusing. Chubb departed, relieved. Purbright sat for some time afterward, staring at the faint cloud of dust caught in the sunlight along his desk. The affair was almost nothing, yet its persistence interested him. In towns like Flaxborough, real crimes were rare, but moral misdemeanours, well-intentioned lies, calculated decencies were abundant and usually more revealing. In the cooperative the following afternoon, Mrs. Binns encountered the vicar's wife. Their exchange was conducted with the ceremonious politeness of women well aware that they are being overheard. My dear, how are you bearing up under all this attention? Oh, quite well, thank you. It's remarkable how quickly people tire of other people's affairs. Indeed, the vicar's wife said. It all seems rather trivial in hindsight. I told the vicar as much. Such wisdom, Mrs. Vane. I envy you your detachment. Mrs. Vane smiled with professional piety. A vicar's wife must cultivate it. We hear everything and believe nothing. I imagine that's much the same as police work, said Mrs. Binns lightly. The other woman looked puzzled, perhaps uncertain whether this was wit or warning. I beg your pardon? Inspector Purbright has been asking after the accounts, I believe. Oh, merely for routine accuracy, Mrs. Vane said quickly. He's most discreet. I'm sure he is, Mrs. Binns replied. That's what makes him dangerous. By the end of that week, Miss Teal had resigned from her secretarial duties. Her letter, written on onion skin paper, in trembling cursive, cited medical exhaustion, and concluded with a line that, when quoted later, gave the impression of confession without content. I no longer feel equal to the moral burdens of parish life. The vicar, reading it aloud to his wife, declared it a pity. His wife, folding laundry with sharp efficiency, replied, "Yes, but a necessary one." Purbright, when told, merely raised an eyebrow. "Resignation," he remarked, "is often a more comfortable refuge than explanation." That evening he walked the short distance from the station to the post office, his coat collar turned up against a drizzle that seemed more administrative than meteorological. Passing Mrs. Binns's house, he noticed the warm square of light from her sitting-room window. Through the half-drawn curtain he could just discern her silhouette, bent over some task at the table, writing, perhaps, or balancing accounts. The motion of her hand was steady, unhurried. A curious thing, he reflected, that Mrs. Binns, whose husband had been, by all accounts, a parsimonious civil servant, should possess a handwriting so graceful and expensive-looking. 2 mornings later, Mrs. Vane's maid discovered an envelope slipped beneath the vestry door. It contained 30 shillings in notes and a brief, unsigned message typed on cheap paper for the ticket purchased in error, kindly credit to parish funds. The vicar examined it with the gravity of a man confronted by moral arithmetic beyond his training. "This, my dear," he told his wife, "is the end of the matter." She, less confident, remarked, "If it is, it's a very tidy end. Too tidy." When the envelope reached Inspector Purbright, via Constable Chubb, who disliked mysteries with typewriters in them, he noted the misaligned E in the word ticket. The same defect appeared in the Women's Institute circulars, all typed on Miss Teal's machine. He said nothing. Instead, he placed the note in his desk drawer beside the surviving Raffle stub and closed it carefully, as though preserving not evidence, but etiquette. That afternoon, Purbright saw Mrs. Binns again. She was in the market, examining a selection of fish with professional detachment. "A pound of haddock, Mrs. Fenner, please," she said, "and no bones, if you can manage it." When she turned, she greeted Purbright with faint surprise, as though meeting him were an unplanned but harmless recurrence. "Inspector, you do shop here?" "Occasionally. It's one of the few places in Flaxborough where things are openly priced." She smiled at that. "And yet we all pay more than we should." "Do we?" "Oh yes, even honesty costs something." He inclined his head, but she was already turning away, her purchase wrapped neatly in brown paper. Watching her go, Purbright wondered, not for the first time, whether Mrs. Binns's poise came from innocence or from long practice at disguising its absence. As he walked back to the station, he noticed the vicar's wife crossing the street ahead, her pace brisk, her face set in the expression of a woman determined to be above something. Flaxborough, it seemed, had once again achieved its peculiar equilibrium, a perfect stillness arranged carefully over a fault line. That evening Purbright received a call from Constable Chubb. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "about that typewritten note. Miss Teal's given her machine to the jumble sale. Thought you might like to know." Purbright thanked him and hung up. He sat a while in silence, looking at the envelope in his drawer, at the steady, unblinking eye of the desk lamp. Outside, the town lay muffled in fog. Somewhere in the dark, a church bell marked the hour with unnecessary precision. Purbright reached for his pen, hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Tidiness," he murmured, "is rarely innocent." Miss Flora Teal had the particular air of a woman to whom correctness had long been a form of oxygen. Her posture, even in apology, remained perpendicular. Her diction was so precise that one could almost hear it punctuating itself. She arrived at Flaxborough Police Station one Tuesday morning in April, wearing a pale grey coat of a type once described as sensible, and now, in her case, almost defiant. Inspector Purbright, who had spent the morning reading a file of more mechanical misdemeanours, stolen bicycles, improperly tied loads, and the municipal tedium of civic life, rose courteously to greet her. "Miss Teal," he said, "a pleasant surprise." "Not, I'm afraid, Inspector, a social call," she replied, clasping her gloves as though to restrain them from complicity. "I have come to apologize." Purbright, who had found apologies in Flaxborough to be rarer than explanations and often less convincing, indicated the chair opposite his desk. "That's always an intriguing beginning." She sat uncomfortably upright. "It concerns the incident of the raffle ticket." "I was mistaken, entirely mistaken." "Indeed?" "Yes, it was Mrs. Vane's handwriting, not Mrs. Binns's. I realized later, after reflection, I should never have spoken at the meeting. It has caused distress." Purbright regarded her evenly. "To whom?" "To everyone, I think," said Miss Teal, her mouth tightening as though the word had a sour taste. "Particularly Mrs. Binns, who I am told was humiliated." "Ah, I had not noticed humiliation." Miss Teal lowered her gaze. "You may not always see what women feel, Inspector. We conceal it better than men, perhaps." Purbright smiled faintly. "Or practice it more often." The remark slid past her unacknowledged. She was not here to exchange wit. "I only wish to correct the record," she continued, "and to assure you that there was no impropriety in the matter. I was misled by the light, and by my own—" She paused delicately. "Zeal." "A rare affliction in Flaxborough," murmured Purbright. "And the second ticket? Has it been found?" "I have been told it was misfiled. These things happen." Purbright nodded, making no notes. He never did when someone seemed too eager to be believed. "And you are satisfied?" Her hands clasped tighter. "Satisfied, yes, but not easy." He looked at her kindly. "If you will forgive my observation, Miss Teal, you appear rather less at ease now than you did when you were mistaken." She blinked, as though startled by a draught of honesty. "It has been a trying time, Inspector. People talk." "In Flaxborough, surely not." That won a faint smile, brittle but genuine. "They mean no harm, but harm results just the same." She rose then, briskly, as if movement could restore her composure. "You will tell anyone who asks that I have corrected my error." "I shall tell anyone who asks precisely what you have said." "That is sufficient." She left the room with the same prim efficiency with which she had entered, pausing only to nod gravely at Constable Chubb, who saluted as though acknowledging an officer of equal rank. Later that afternoon, Sergeant Love brought in a file marked "Miscellaneous Correspondence," which by long tradition meant gossip in official paper form. Among the letters was one from a certain concerned parishioner, unsigned but typed, urging the police to discourage further interference in charitable affairs by those of an excitable disposition. Purbright read it twice and folded it neatly back into the envelope. "Do you know what this is, love?" he asked. "No, sir, though it sounds like something written by my aunt after 3 sherries." "Almost," said Purbright, "but the punctuation's too precise. This has the tone of Miss Teal's moral exhaustion translated into type." "Should we speak to her again?" "No. People who wish to withdraw from their own stories should be allowed to." The next morning, the Flaxborough Chronicle announced without irony that Miss Teal had resigned from the parish committee to attend to her health. The phrase "attend to" carried in Flaxborough a broad latitude of meaning. It could imply rest, remorse, or retreat. Mrs. Binns read the item at breakfast, stirring her tea with tranquil satisfaction. When her neighbour, Mr. Pargeter, called shortly afterward to borrow her newspaper, she was already polishing her teaspoons, a task she reserved for moments of strategic calm. "Poor Miss Teal," she said mildly, "so fragile." "Ah," said Pargeter, accepting the newspaper, "some people don't take exposure well." "I beg your pardon." "I mean the limelight, Mrs. Binns. It can be unkind to delicate temperaments." "Quite so," she replied. her tone flat enough to suggest a closing door. I myself have always preferred shade. Purbright, had he overheard, might have smiled at the neatness of the remark. That afternoon, Purbright encountered Mrs. Binns by chance at the lending library. She was standing in the aisle between domestic guidance and historical romance, both categories she seemed to dominate by temperament. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Binns." "Inspector, what a coincidence. I was just looking for something to quiet the mind." "Crime fiction may disappoint you, then?" She smiled. "Not crime, Inspector. Calm. There's a difference." "Not always," said Purbright. Her glance flicked over the book in his hand, Drainage and Local Government, 1937. "Ah, you read for excitement." "I find it more reliable than people," he replied. Mrs. Binns turned a page thoughtfully. "Do you know, Inspector, I think people behave more decently when they believe they are being watched." "A useful principle," Purbright said, "for both police and parish committees." Her eyes rested on him for a moment longer than necessary. "Yes, though it must be exhausting to watch so much and say so little." Purbright inclined his head. "Fortunately, I am well practiced in silence." That evening, Sergeant Love returned from an errand to report, with some embarrassment, that he had overheard talk at the Coach and Horses. "About our raffle?" asked Purbright. "Yes, sir. Seems some folk think Miss Teal wasn't wrong at all, just persuaded to be. The vicar's wife said something about smoothing over unpleasantness for the sake of the parish." Purbright sighed. "Ah, the eternal task of the righteous, to conceal sin until it looks charitable." Love frowned. "Do you think Miss Teal's telling the truth now, sir?" Purbright smiled thinly. "My dear Love, in Flaxborough, truth is a communal project. Everyone adds a bit of polish until it no longer offends." He dismissed Love with a gentle wave and spent the rest of the evening leafing through the file on local charitable events, an archive of social decency maintained with almost devotional accuracy. It was there, among the neat columns of donations, that he noticed a minor curiosity. The previous year's raffle had also listed a Mrs. F. Binns, not as a winner, but as a contributor of 1 guinea in lieu of attendance. The handwriting beside it, certifying receipt, was Miss Teal's. The following morning dawned pale and windless. Purbright walked to the church hall, ostensibly to deliver a notice about parking regulations, but with the unhurried interest of a man who suspects the scenery may have started to whisper. He found Mrs. Vane, the vicar's wife, arranging hymn books on a table. "Inspector," she said, smiling with that precise cheer peculiar to those who serve both God and committee. "We weren't expecting a visit from authority today." "I try not to make a habit of it," he replied. "Though authority, like mildew, thrives best in damp corners." She laughed uneasily. "How very droll." Purbright handed over his notice. "While I'm here, Mrs. Vane, I'm told that Miss Teal's resignation has left quite a gap." "It has," she said, smoothing the pile of hymn books unnecessarily. "A dreadful shame, but she was overwrought. And the matter with Mrs. Binns, well, we've all agreed to let it rest." "A wise decision," Purbright said. "I take it the accounts are in order now?" Her hands froze for a moment over the hymn books. "Perfectly, Inspector. I've checked them myself." "I'm sure you have," said Purbright. She looked up quickly, but his face was bland and courteous. When he left, she watched him go, her expression tightened by a thought she could not comfortably confess. That evening, Purbright received a brief report from Constable Chubb. Miss Teal, it appeared, had placed her typewriter for sale in the window of Rudd's stationery shop. "Says she's done with committees," Chubb added. Purbright thanked him, then sat back, considering. A woman suddenly withdrawing from public life, a ticket that vanished only to be replaced by money typed on a machine, now conveniently for sale. These were not crimes, they were symptoms. In Flaxborough, guilt was never about the law. It was about the balance between what one could bear to remember and what one could persuade others to forget. Purbright looked out of the window. Across the street, Mrs. Binns was locking her gate, her movements measured, economical. The evening light caught the small brooch at her collar, a modest silver circle, but polished to a brilliance that drew the eye. He watched her until she turned the corner, then returned to his desk, where Miss Teal's unsigned letter still rested in its envelope. He read it again, then, almost absently, noticed a faint smear of lavender scent clinging to the paper. He closed the drawer gently. "Tidiness again," he murmured. But whose? By early May, Mrs. Vane's garden had reached the particular stage of English perfection that arouses in its owner both pride and discontent. Tulips stood like congregants who had been lectured about posture, and a pale green lawn rolled out so smooth it seemed to discourage conversation. The afternoon tea, held ostensibly for ladies of the parish, had a distinctly diplomatic air. Too many scones, too few genuine smiles. Mrs. Vane, in an apron of floral martyrdom, presided from the shade of a parasol, greeting each guest as though inspecting contrition. She had invited Miss Teal, though she knew the invitation would not be accepted, and Mrs. Binns, though she hoped it would not. Both hopes were gratified. Inspector Purbright arrived precisely at 4, in civilian clothes and an expression of mild curiosity. His invitation had been couched in civic terms. A little gathering, informal, to encourage community harmony. He suspected that harmony, like jam, would be spread thin. "Inspector," said Mrs. Vane, advancing with an air of dignified forgiveness, "you are very welcome. We are delighted to see the police in so pleasant a context for once." Purbright inclined his head. "We try to appear harmless now and then." She smiled tightly, as though humour were an indulgence, and gestured toward a cluster of chairs arranged near the shrubbery. The company was composed largely of women whose names seemed perpetually prefixed by Mrs. or Miss, as though individuality might be misinterpreted as defiance. Mrs. Binns was there after all, seated beside the vicar's sister, her expression composed to a degree that suggested rehearsal. Her hat of indeterminate beige looked like a diplomatic compromise between modesty and ambition. The conversation, when it came, was of the sort that never left traces, remarks about the weather, about the choir's new hymnals, about the vicar's cough, which was said to be devotional in origin. It hovered politely above the subject that had brought them all together in uneasy relation, the raffle and the scandal that had for a week fluttered the curtains of every respectable home in Flaxborough. Purbright listened with the benign inattention of a man accustomed to hearing truth sifted through lace. He observed how Mrs. Binns's laughter arrived half a second too late, and how Mrs. Vane's glance lingered a fraction too long on the teapot, as though calculating the moral strength of a refill. At one point, Miss Trott, the parish organist, leaned toward him with the breathless confidentiality of one who believes discretion a form of virtue. "I do hope Miss Teal is recovering. She's such a precise person, but I suppose precision is a burden." "Indeed," said Purbright, "though in Flaxborough imperfection tends to be a group effort." She looked momentarily puzzled, then smiled as if uncertain whether she had been complimented. After half an hour of moral hydration, the talk turned inevitably to the forthcoming summer fete. Mrs. Vane, as chair of the Committee for Civic Benevolence, addressed the matter with the tone of one conducting a memorial service. "We must, I think, be extremely careful this year," she said, glancing vaguely in Mrs. Binns's direction. "Last year's unpleasantness reminded us that carelessness in administration can lead to misunderstandings. We must be more transparent. Mrs. Binns adjusted her gloves with a small, dry sound. Transparency, dear Mrs. Vane, can be quite indecent if pursued too far. I have always believed that good works are better accomplished under a veil. Indeed, said Mrs. Vane, but sometimes veils become shrouds, don't they? A silence followed, light but decisive. The vicar's sister coughed gently as though to reinstate civilization. Purbright, watching from his seat, thought how well Flaxborough's society resembled its gardens, cultivated, symmetrical, and quietly carnivorous beneath the blossoms. After tea, Mrs. Vane insisted on showing the inspector her new herbaceous border. It ran along the edge of the lawn, an intricate embroidery of lavender, phlox, and obedience. "You see," she said, walking slowly beside him, "I find it calming to have things in order. Plants, committees, accounts, anything that can be arranged properly." "A tidy world is a rare comfort," Purbright said. "Yes, though one must sometimes prune rather severely." She looked up at him. "Have you heard from Miss Teal lately?" Purbright shook his head. "I understand she's sold her typewriter." "So I read. Tragic, in a way. The poor woman relied on it for expression. Once people stop writing letters, Inspector, they often stop justifying themselves altogether." Purbright smiled faintly. A risky silence in Flaxborough. She turned back toward her roses. "Still, I suppose one must forgive her. We all make errors." "Yes," said Purbright, "though some errors are strangely profitable." Her hand paused above a rosebud. "Profitable?" "In reputation, I mean. Contrition, handled correctly, can improve one's standing considerably." Mrs. Vane's smile returned, smooth as enamel. "How very cynical, Inspector. One might think you doubted sincerity." "I find it safer to admire its rarity." They stood for a moment in companionable disapproval of one another. As the guests departed, Purbright lingered, his manner politely indolent. He thanked Mrs. Vane for the tea and remarked on her efficient hospitality. Then, as though by afterthought, he said, "I wonder, Mrs. Vane, if you recall who prepared the list of prizes for last year's raffle?" She hesitated. "Miss Teal, I believe, though we all approved it." "And this year?" "I've done it myself. I've found one learns best by experience." "Indeed," said Purbright. "Do you happen to have a copy of last year's list still?" "I should imagine so. Everything is kept in the vestry filing cabinet. Would you like to see it?" "If it's not inconvenient." She smiled with polite uncertainty. "I dare say the vicar would not object, though he dislikes secular papers among the sacred." "Quite understandable," Purbright said. "Temptation often comes disguised as stationery." She looked at him sharply, but he was adjusting his hat with mild abstraction. The vestry smelled of dust and hymnals. A single high window admitted a slice of cautious light. Mrs. Vane, selecting a key from a chain at her waist, opened a narrow metal cabinet with the air of unveiling domestic relics. "There we are," she said, withdrawing a folder marked Fête Accounts, 1957. Purbright took it carefully, turning the pages with a scholar's attention. Lists of prizes, cake tins, scarves, a pair of gloves, and, under the heading Special Contribution, a note, Anonymous Donor, Silver Brooch, value 15s, 6d. "Do you recall this item, Mrs. Vane?" "I do. It was very pretty, though not of great worth. A circular design, I think." "Who won it?" She frowned delicately. "Oh dear, I believe Mrs. Binns. Yes, that's right." Purbright closed the folder. "A fortunate woman. She seems to win more often than chance allows." Mrs. Vane said nothing. Her eyes flicked once to his face, then away, as though measuring how much he might already know. When Purbright returned to the police station that evening, he found Sergeant Love bent over a sheet of paper with the puzzled reverence of one attempting long division. "Sir," said Love, looking up, "that list of raffle donors, you said I should see if any handwriting matched Miss Teal's?" "Yes." "Well, there's something odd. Most of the records are in her hand, neat as a ledger, but there's one correction in another pen, anonymous donor silver brooch. Different ink, different script, I'd say written after the rest." Purbright sat down, unbuttoning his coat. "After Miss Teal typed her final list, perhaps?" "Could be. Maybe added later, sir." "By whom?" Love shrugged. "Hard to say. The vicar's wife signed the bottom, as treasurer." Purbright nodded slowly. Yes, she would. He remained seated long after Love had gone, watching the dusk gather around the station yard. Across the square the lamps blinked into life, reflecting in the puddles left by a brief afternoon shower. In his mind the pieces arranged themselves with Flaxborough's characteristic neatness: a withdrawn secretary, a self-effacing donor, a convenient brooch, and a vicar's wife who prided herself on spiritual tidiness. He reached into his drawer for Miss Teal's letter, unfolded it once more, and read the final line aloud, almost as a courtesy. Some things are better mislaid than explained. Purbright replaced the letter and smiled faintly. "Yes," he murmured, "but not forever." Outside, in the cool stillness, the church clock began to strike 7, measured, decorous, and faintly accusatory. The vestry, when unoccupied, had a smell composed of furniture polish, damp wool, and an older, more ecclesiastical melancholy. It was a room of suspended propriety, half divine, half administrative. Dust rose from the hymn book covers in particles of reverence. The Reverend Mr. Vane had made it his retreat, in preference to the vicarage drawing-room, where his wife's presence often gave the impression that he was intruding upon a well-run institution. On Thursday afternoons he would sit at his narrow desk, producing sermons of circumspect mildness that offended no one and inspired roughly the same number. It was in the midst of such mild industry that Inspector Purbright called. The Reverend looked up from his sermon notes, blinking behind spectacles that conferred upon him the look of an earnest owl. "Inspector, I hope there's no, disturbance?" "None at all," said Purbright cheerfully. "Just a trifling matter of record." The Reverend gestured toward a chair. "You will forgive me if I go on writing. I find it easier to think with a pen in my hand." "Of course," Purbright said, seating himself. "It's a rare gift. Most people find it easier to talk when they shouldn't." The Reverend smiled vaguely, as though uncertain whether to agree. Purbright waited for a moment, then said, "I've been looking into the arrangements for last year's fete, purely as background, you understand. There are 1 or 2 inconsistencies in the accounts, though nothing criminal, I dare say." "Inconsistencies?" The Reverend set down his pen, not alarmed, but curious, as one might be upon hearing that a hymn tune contained a hidden jest. "Minor things," Purbright said lightly. "A correction on the donor list, a missing receipt, the disappearance of a brooch." "Ah, yes, the raffle prizes. My wife handles all that." "So I understand. A very efficient lady, Mrs. Vane." "She is almost too efficient at times. You know how it is with people of conscience. They cannot let sleeping details lie." Purbright nodded gravely. "And Miss Teal? She was your secretary for those arrangements, I believe?" "For years, yes. Most diligent. A little, exacting perhaps, but no harm in that." "No harm," Purbright agreed, "until it becomes inconvenient." The Reverend looked up, mildly startled. "Inconvenient?" Purbright smiled, a polite smile that contained nothing. "For others, I mean. Accuracy can make people uncomfortable." Yes, quite so." He dabbed his pen absently in the inkwell. "My wife said Miss Teal had been overwrought of late. Some confusion over a ticket or something." "Just so," said Purbright, "and confusion, once introduced, has a remarkable talent for self-preservation." A small silence formed, in which the ticking of the vestry clock began to sound like reproach. Then the Reverend coughed. "Was there anything specific you wished to examine, Inspector?" Purbright leaned back slightly. "The prize list, if it's not too much trouble. I understand it's kept here." "Yes, yes. Bottom drawer, right-hand side." The Reverend pulled open the drawer with the air of a man revealing nothing more controversial than stationery. Inside were folders of receipts, typed minutes, and, incongruously, a small sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges. Purbright's eyes rested upon it. "And this?" The Reverend looked mildly embarrassed. "Ah, that was given to me by my wife some months ago. Something Miss Teal left behind, I think. I never got round to returning it." Purbright extended his hand. "May I?" "By all means." The envelope, addressed in Miss Teal's sharp, deliberate handwriting, bore a single word, accounts. Inside was a single sheet of notepaper, folded twice. It contained a short list of figures, neatly aligned, and one penciled note in the margin. Duplicate entry. Check donor signature. Purbright turned the paper over, though there was nothing on the reverse. "Curious," he murmured. The Reverend peered over his spectacles. "I'm sure it's nothing improper. My wife verified all those figures, you know." "Indeed," said Purbright. "Verification has become something of a parish pastime." He folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. As he rose to go, Purbright allowed his eye to travel along the shelf above the desk, hymnals, service registers, a small box marked "Communion Wine, Stock Check." "I suppose," he said casually, "that the fate funds are kept here as well." "Oh, good heavens, no," said the Reverend quickly. "My wife manages those. She's far better with arithmetic than I." Purbright smiled. "That I don't doubt." He replaced his hat, nodded courteously, and left. The Reverend listened to the sound of retreating footsteps, then sat back down, frowning faintly at the open drawer. After a moment's hesitation, he removed the envelope again and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. Then, as if conscious of committing a domestic indiscretion, he locked it. Outside, Purbright paused by the low churchyard wall. Beyond the headstones lay the modest hum of Flaxborough, milk vans, distant bells, and the steady commerce of mutual curiosity. He stood there a while, watching the ordinary piece of things, which in Flaxborough was never quite as serene as it appeared. Sergeant Love, arriving in the police car a few minutes later, found his superior thus occupied. "Sir, I've just spoken with Rudd Stationery about Miss Teal's typewriter." "Ah?" "Sold all right 2 weeks ago. Cash. Buyer left no name, but Rudd says it was a lady, middle-aged, well-spoken, said she needed it for committee minutes." Purbright's eyes twinkled faintly. "How remarkably civic-minded. Did she, by chance, leave any address?" "No, sir." "But Rudd remembered her perfume. Lavender, he said, the strong kind." Purbright's expression remained pleasantly neutral. "That does narrow it down in Flaxborough." That evening, over tea in the station canteen, Love continued to speculate in the earnest, untutored way of a man convinced that deduction was mostly a matter of enthusiasm. "I keep thinking, sir, why would Miss Teal write duplicate entry? Could be a simple bookkeeping slip, couldn't it?" "It could," Purbright admitted, "but Miss Teal doesn't strike me as a woman to leave duplicates unexamined." "Maybe she meant the brooch donation. Someone gave it twice?" Purbright stirred his tea. "Or once, under 2 names. Love frowned. "You mean one person pretending to be another?" "In Flaxborough, Sergeant, that's almost a civic duty." At 9 that night, Purbright called at the vicarage. Mrs. Vane received him in the sitting-room, where the light from a single standard lamp fell upon the gleam of porcelain and the faintly militant order of the furniture. "Inspector," she said, rising, "this is unexpected." "I do apologize. I've just come from the vestry." Her expression shifted, no more than the lift of an eyebrow. "I trust you didn't disturb my husband's papers?" "Only an envelope addressed in Miss Teal's hand." "I see." She resumed her seat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Miss Teal was inclined to over-document things. I believe she distrusted delegation." "That's a common condition," Purbright said mildly, "especially among those who know too much about the people they delegate to." Mrs. Vane smiled with great composure. "You do have a way of flattering human nature, Inspector." "I try to be accurate." A small pause settled between them, polite, symmetrical, faintly hostile. "I shall, of course," Mrs. Vane said at last, "be happy to assist if the police require any clarification." "Thank you. For now I'm merely verifying small discrepancies. For instance, there appears to have been a duplicate entry in the fate accounts, no doubt a clerical oversight." "I'm sure it was." "Strange, though," Purbright added softly, "that Miss Teal would draw attention to it in pencil. She preferred ink for everything, especially correction." Mrs. Vane's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "I wouldn't know her habits that intimately." "No, of course not." Purbright rose, offering a courteous bow of his head. "You keep an admirable household, Mrs. Vane, very precise." She met his gaze steadily. "Thank you, Inspector. Order is a form of faith." "Indeed," he said, "though some faiths require confession." She smiled, but her eyes did not. "Good evening, Inspector." Purbright walked home under the dim amber lamps of the high street. The town was quiet, its inhabitants, he reflected, at rest after another day's effort to appear unremarkable. He thought of Miss Teal, of the sealed envelope, of Mrs. Vane's lavender composure. Reaching his small sitting room, he took from his pocket the slip of paper he had quietly substituted for Miss Teal's note in the vestry envelope, a sheet identical in weight, but blank. The real note lay on his table, its penciled margin faint but clear. He turned it under the lamp, studying the indentations of handwriting. Another line, faintly pressed, beneath Miss Teal's own. "Ask about the second ticket." He smiled very slightly. "Ah," he murmured. "The second again." Then he folded the paper carefully, as though it were fragile, and placed it between the pages of a notebook marked "Inquiries. Pending." Outside, the church clock struck 10, and its chime seemed, for once, a little uncertain. The Reverend Mr. Vane had never been a man who courted either sin or conversation. His piety was mild, his speech moderate, and his enthusiasm for parish administration entirely sincere. In short, he was the sort of clergyman upon whom a community might rely, particularly if one required sermons shorter than 15 minutes or silence in moments of moral inconvenience. On the evening following Inspector Purbright's visit, the Reverend sat alone in the vicarage study. The clock above the mantel ticked with ecclesiastical steadiness. Mrs. Vane had retired early, pleading fatigue, though her fatigue, as often, had seemed organized rather than felt. He was reviewing the forthcoming Sunday's sermon, something on the virtue of restraint, when a soft knock sounded at the door. It was Harriet, the housemaid, her expression a model of vague deference. "Begging pardon, sir, but the churchwarden called earlier. He left this for you." She placed a small envelope upon the desk, its flap unsealed. "Thank you, Harriet," said the Reverend. "That will be all." When she had gone, he turned the envelope over in his hand. It bore his name in a familiar, neat script, Miss Teal's. Inside was a short note. "Reverend Vane, please forgive the liberty, but I feel it my duty to record certain irregularities in last year's fate accounts. I cannot in conscience remain silent. You will find the evidence in the vestry drawer marked Receipts, Miscellaneous. Yours, faithfully, Flora Teal. The note was undated. The Reverend sat for some minutes, staring at it. Then, with the slow composure of a man accustomed to small perplexities, he replaced it in the envelope and set it upon the edge of the desk. He did not, however, open the vestry drawer to which it referred. The next morning, Mrs. Vane found him at breakfast unusually silent, even by his own standards. "You're not unwell, I hope?" she asked, spreading marmalade with the serene precision of one applying a varnish. "No, my dear, merely contemplative." "About what?" "The fête." Mrs. Vane looked up briefly, her eyes cool. "It has been and gone, George. We have a new one to occupy us." "Still," he said, stirring his tea, "Miss Teal wrote to me, apparently about the accounts." Her spoon paused mid-air. "Wrote to you?" "Yes, left a note. Something about irregularities." "How extraordinary. She's already apologized publicly for that nonsense." He smiled faintly. "I'm aware. Nevertheless, she seems to have wished for further expression." Mrs. Vane folded her napkin carefully, her movements betraying the faintest tremor of irritation. "I trust you've destroyed it." "I have not. It seemed uncharitable." "Charity, George, does not require the preservation of mischief." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "Mischief is a strong word." "Then choose one more pastoral if you like," she said. "But you might consider the effect of such things on others. On me, for instance." "I always do," he said quietly. That answer, which was neither agreement nor refusal, seemed to satisfy her less than silence would have. Later that morning, Purbright paid an unannounced call under the pretext of returning a borrowed parish register. The Reverend received him in the study, the air thick with the combined odour of damp sermons and domestic caution. "I was passing," said Purbright, "and thought I might relieve you of an old burden." He placed the register on the desk. "Do you happen to recall when Miss Teal last attended committee business here?" The Reverend adjusted his spectacles. "Her final meeting was early March, I believe. She left shortly afterward. Some fatigue." "Ah, yes," said Purbright. "Fatigue seems to have overtaken half the parish this year. Even the constables look wan." The Reverend smiled uncertainly. "We all labour under duties, Inspector." "Indeed, though some duties leave their mark more clearly than others." Purbright's gaze drifted toward the desk. "That's a familiar handwriting, if I'm not mistaken." The Reverend followed his eyes to the envelope still resting there. "Miss Teal's," he said. "A personal note, nothing official." Purbright nodded, unhurried. Miss Teal was a meticulous woman. It's unusual for her to write anything unofficial. The Reverend folded his hands together, a gesture that might have been prayer or protection. "I should prefer not to discuss it." "As you wish," Purbright said mildly. "Though if it concerns parish accounts, you may find it safer to let such things be discussed in confidence." "Mrs. Vane has already managed the matter," said the Reverend, a little too quickly. Purbright smiled. "So I understand." He rose, brushed an invisible fleck from his sleeve, and added, "You know, I often think honesty is like gardening, Reverend. It thrives best when someone else does the pruning." The Reverend made no reply, and Purbright, with a courteous inclination of the head, withdrew. That afternoon, Mrs. Vane found the note gone. She discovered its absence by accident. Searching the desk for her husband's sermon draft, she noticed the empty space where the envelope had been. "George," she said when he entered, "you've moved Miss Teal's letter?" "Yes," he said simply. "Where to?" "I gave it to Inspector Purbright." She stared at him, her face controlled but pale. "You gave it to him?" He asked. I saw no reason to refuse. There are always reasons, she said quietly. Most of them sensible. He sighed, lowering himself into a chair. My dear, if there is nothing wrong, we have nothing to fear. And if there is, well, better he find it gently than not at all. Her composure returned by degrees. You do realize, of course, that your simplicity is sometimes mistaken for virtue. He looked up, almost kindly. And your virtue sometimes for simplicity. The words fell between them like a sermon he had not intended to preach. In the police station later that day, Purbright examined the letter by lamplight. It was precisely as the Reverend had described. Miss Teal's careful, slanted hand, the tone deferential, yet weighted. The reference to irregularities intrigued him less than the phrase, I cannot in conscience remain silent. He murmured it aloud, not in justice, not in duty, but in conscience. Sergeant Love looked up from his desk, puzzled. Sir? Nothing, love. I was admiring Miss Teal's moral vocabulary. Love frowned. Bit high-flown, isn't it, for a Raffle? In Flaxborough, Sergeant, conscience often grows best in shallow soil. He refolded the letter and placed it beside his notebook. There's something else, this mention of the vestry drawer marked Receipts, Miscellaneous. When I looked, there was nothing of the sort. Could have been moved, or removed, Purbright said. The Reverend's desk is tidier than his theology. Love ventured a hesitant smile. You think Mrs. Vane took it? Purbright poured himself tea. I think Mrs. Vane takes whatever she can justify. The next Sunday, the Reverend preached his sermon on restraint to a congregation unusually alert for once, if only because the weather discouraged sleep. Mrs. Vane sat in her pew, head bowed with immaculate decorum, her gloved hands motionless on her lap. Purbright attended, seated near the back, half listening. His attention wandered, not from irreverence, but curiosity. From where he sat, he could observe both Vane and his wife, the faint tension of posture between them, the absence of eye contact. At the end of the service, Mrs. Vane remained momentarily behind, rearranging hymn books that required no rearranging. The vicar joined her, murmured something. She did not look at him. As Purbright rose to leave, he caught the faintest sound, a whispered phrase from Mrs. Vane's lips, not intended for others. Next time, she said, you'll ask me before deciding what's proper. It was said with a serenity that made it colder than anger. Outside, the parishioners spilled into the churchyard, exchanging their usual courtesies about sermons and weather. Purbright lingered by the gate, lighting a cigarette with a care that concealed deliberate observation. Miss Teal, pale and tightly composed, stood at a distance near the lych gate, speaking to no one. She had evidently returned to the fold, though her presence attracted more curiosity than welcome. Her expression was calm, but her gloved hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her handbag. When she noticed Purbright, she offered a polite nod. "Good morning, Inspector." "Miss Teal, you're looking somewhat improved." "Rest, Inspector, and detachment. Both admirable," he said, "and yet you've chosen to return." She smiled faintly. "Even saints return, Inspector. Some of us simply prefer to see whether anything has changed." "Has it?" "I rather think," she said, glancing toward Mrs. Vane, "that some things resist alteration." Her tone was mild, but her gaze lingered too long. Purbright inclined his head. "Constancy is, after all, a virtue." "Or a refuge," she said quietly. That evening, in his study, Purbright opened his file marked "The Widow's Raffle." From his pocket he withdrew Miss Teal's letter and placed it beside his earlier find, the penciled note bearing the phrase, "Ask about the second ticket." He compared the two handwritings, tracing each with his finger. They were identical. He sat back, considering this in silence. Then, with a faint smile that carried neither triumph nor relief, he wrote a single line beneath his notes. Miss Teal knew there was another ticket, but not whose hand held it. He closed the file, extinguished his lamp, and let the quiet of Flaxborough settle again like dust on polished gilt. In Flaxborough, the hospitality of Mrs. Glossop was regarded as a civic endurance test. Tea at her semi-detached villa on Netherton Avenue was a ritual of immense precision and negligible pleasure. The tablecloth was white, the cups translucent, and the biscuits arranged in a pattern that suggested both devotion and anxiety. Inspector Purbright had accepted her invitation because one never declined such things without raising moral suspicion. Mrs. Glossop had, after all, been treasurer of the Women's Guild for nearly 20 years, which in Flaxborough terms placed her halfway to canonization. Such a dreadful business, she said now, pouring tea with an authority that discouraged refusal. The whole town in a state inspector. I dare say it will appear in the Argus again. I told Mrs. Vane that publicity is rarely a friend to religion, but she did not seem grateful. Purbright smiled faintly. The press is rarely a friend to anyone who hasn't died recently. Mrs. Glossop gave a short, approving laugh, one that conveyed moral recognition rather than amusement. It's not the death, of course, she continued. It's the talk. People remember Miss Teal's little ways, her note-writing, for instance, and then begin to wonder what else she might have been writing about. You know how gossip ferments, Inspector. Vigorously, I imagine. Indeed. And now, with her returning to church as if nothing had happened. She paused, letting propriety do the work of condemnation. Well, some find it unsettling. Do you, Mrs. Glossop? She lifted her cup. I find it unnecessary. Purbright nodded, watching the liquid tremble slightly with the force of her opinion. You mentioned she wrote letters? Oh, yes, to anyone she thought needed correction, the guild, the choir, even the mayor, though that one was never acknowledged. Did she ever write to you? Mrs. Glossop's mouth twitched, a small victory of conscience over self-regard. Once, yes. Something about the jumble sale proceeds. She believed I'd overcounted. Did you? Certainly not, though I may have rounded in the church's favour. Purbright inclined his head. A common accounting practice among the devout. She did not seem to detect the irony. Still, she was not unkind, merely exacting, if that's the word. And then, after her husband's death, she became almost pedantic about virtue. I suppose loneliness sharpens a woman's sense of duty. Or dulls her sense of proportion, murmured Purbright. Mrs. Glossop pretended not to hear. You'll know all about that sort of thing, of course. Motives and consciences. I sometimes think you must tire of people's explanations. Only when they're too neat, said Purbright. I'm more interested in their silences. She smiled approvingly, as if this were a moral insight shared between equals. That's very wise, though in Flaxborough, silence often means good manners. Or good fortune, he said, depending on who benefits. There was a pause, filled by the delicate rattle of teaspoons, a sound that in Mrs. Glossop's drawing-room carried the weight of confession. After the third cup of tea and the second anecdote about the vicar's garden fete, Purbright asked, Did Miss Teal ever speak of the raffle directly? Mrs. Glossop stiffened slightly. She mentioned it, yes. Said something about fairness, but then she always did. I told her that one cannot run a raffle without some degree of chance. She replied that chance is God's arithmetic, which struck me as rather blasphemous. Did she keep her own tickets? Of course, she bought 2, perhaps 3. She was never extravagant, but she did like to demonstrate support. In fact, I remember teasing her about it. Teasing? Yes, I said if she won her own prize, We'd all suspect she'd arranged it. She looked rather pale and said, "I doubt that would be my good fortune." It seemed an odd remark at the time. Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "Do you recall her prizes? First was the lace tablecloth, second the tea hamper, third the donation from Mrs. Vane, the crystal decanter. The widow Teal's name appeared, I think, for the second drawer, but she insisted on giving the hamper away to the orphanage." "Generous of her?" "Or guilty," said Mrs. Glossop with the piety of one who relishes ambiguity. "You see, Inspector, some women do good merely to erase the record of something less admirable." "Do they?" said Purbright mildly. "You must have observed much of human nature in your committee work." "An unfortunate amount," she said primly. "The Guild can be quite as political as the Town Council, and sometimes less forgiving." He smiled. "Then you have my sympathy." It was clear from her expression that sympathy, like scandal, was best reserved for others. When Purbright left the Glossop residence, the afternoon had settled into that dull, unadventurous light particular to respectable towns. He walked the short distance to the High Street, his mind turning over her recollection of Miss Teal's phrase, "I doubt that would be my good fortune." The remark had the curious weight of a woman who already knew the outcome of an event she hadn't yet attended. At the corner tobacconist, he encountered Sergeant Love, who was loitering with the innocence of someone pretending not to wait. "Ah, there you are, sir," Love said, with the manner of a man about to produce something unimportant and make it sound otherwise. "Post just came in from headquarters, nothing thrilling. But there's this." He handed over a small brown envelope. Inside was a typed note from the County Records Office, confirming Purbright's earlier request. Miss Flora Teal, death of Mr. Henry Teal, no probate record filed, estate valued at nil. Purbright folded the note. "Nil," he said. "That's a theological word if ever there was one." Love frowned. "Meaning she didn't inherit anything?" "Precisely. Or if she did, she failed to admit it to the state." "Do you reckon that's why she bought 2 raffle tickets? Hope of a windfall?" Purbright smiled thinly. "I doubt Miss Teal relied on chance. She was a woman who preferred moral arithmetic." Love scratched his chin. "Can't say I follow." "Don't trouble to, neither does Flaxborough." Later that day, Purbright stopped at the church. The Reverend was out visiting, but Mrs. Vane was in the vestry, rearranging hymnals that had survived perfectly well without her intervention. "Inspector," she said, looking up with that poised smile peculiar to the virtuous when visited by authority. "I do hope you've finished questioning the entire town. It's becoming rather wearing." "I doubt I'll manage the entire town, Mrs. Vane. A few will always remain above suspicion." "I expect you flatter me," she said, turning a page. "Flattery requires imagination," said Purbright. "I rely on observation." She regarded him with polite distaste. "Then you must be sorely disappointed." "On the contrary, you're remarkably consistent." Her hands paused. "Consistent?" "Yes. You always refer to the fête as last year's, though it was held in February. Most would call that this year's. Precision, Inspector, is a habit one acquires through bookkeeping." "I thought as much," he said. "And, speaking of books, did you happen to remove any documents from the vestry drawer marked Receipts, Miscellaneous?" She replaced the hymnal carefully, aligning it with the others. "The Reverend and I agreed that drawer was better kept empty. Temptation, Inspector, is best managed by prevention." "Indeed," said Purbright, "though some might argue that prevention implies foreknowledge." Her smile thinned. "Do you accuse us of clairvoyance?" "Merely prudence," he said, and took his leave. That evening, at the police station, Purbright sat reviewing his notes. The letter from Miss Teal, the vicar's complacency, Mrs. Vane's precision, Mrs. Glossop's gossip, all pieces of the same polite puzzle, none of them dramatic, all of them faintly misaligned. He found himself dwelling again on Mrs. Glossop's recollection. "I doubt that would be my good fortune." Love, still at his desk, was muttering over an expense form. "Sir," he said, "something odd about the raffle list. The prize record we got from Mrs. Vane, there's 2 numbers missing, one between 18 and 20, and another between 41 and 43. Purbright looked up. "2 missing?" "Yes, sir." He leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "Perhaps one of them was Miss Teal's second ticket." Love blinked. "You mean she had 2 winning numbers?" "Or one too many," said Purbright. "And someone preferred not to admit it." He rose, stretched, and reached for his coat. "Come along, love. We might pay the church another visit tomorrow. I think Miss Teal's conscience wasn't the only one that required arithmetic." As he left the office, he paused by the door and glanced at the window. The light of Flaxborough evening, faint and yellow against the fog. He murmured to himself, 2 tickets, 1 widow. But which one's truly hers? And with that mild and unhurried question, the night folded itself gently around the town once more. The committee room in the parish hall smelled of polished wood, ink, and faintly sour tea. Sunlight slanted through the high windows, striking the long table, and catching dust motes as though they were small evidences of moral failings. Chairs had been arranged with military precision, though the occupants were far less regimented. Inspector Purbright arrived punctually, noting with mild amusement how the town's self-appointed custodians of civility already appeared to resent his presence. Mrs. Vane presided at the head of the table, her posture immaculate, her glance sweeping the room as if accounting for both virtue and sin. "Inspector," she said with formal warmth, "we are delighted you could join us. I hope you will find our discussion—" "Endlessly enlightening," Purbright supplied, seating himself with the easy detachment of one accustomed to observing rather than participating. Mrs. Binns was already there, her gloves in her lap, her expression a precise balance of cordiality and vigilance. Across from her sat Mrs. Glossop, whose sharp eyes followed every movement, and Miss Trott, the organist, who seemed ready to record not only minutes but moral transgressions. "Let us commence," Mrs. Vane said, clearing her throat. "We are here to review the arrangements for the summer fete. In particular, the raffle prizes and their allocation." Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. In Flaxborough, this was the point at which subtle conflicts usually surfaced. Mrs. Binns began with what seemed practised care. "I hope we are all agreed that last year's issues, the confusion surrounding Miss Teal's tickets, are not to recur." Miss Trott gave a thin, approving nod. "Yes, the matter caused considerable discussion. I fear some parishioners still whisper." "Whispering is the lowest form of dissent," said Mrs. Vane. "We must maintain decorum. The records must be complete and visible." Purbright listened, noting the particular way Mrs. Binns's eyelids flickered when the widow Teal's name was mentioned. It was slight, almost imperceptible, yet he had grown accustomed to reading the small tells of reputational anxiety in Flaxborough society. "The prize list has been reviewed by Mrs. Vane," said Mrs. Glossop, "except for the new donation from the Silvermere estate, which arrived anonymously." "Anonymous, you say?" Purbright inquired. "Yes," she said. "No note, no identification. The donor insisted on discretion. The committee deemed it prudent to accept it and record it simply as a miscellaneous prize." Mrs. Binns's hand moved slightly, brushing the edge of the table. "That is fortunate," she said. "No one can claim undue advantage. Transparency is preserved." Transparency is often in the eye of the beholder, Purbright murmured, eliciting polite smiles. Mrs. Vane consulted her meticulously typed agenda. The tickets will be distributed as usual, 2 per household. Any additional entries must be declared in writing with the donor's signature. Miss Teal has kindly offered to assist again, though I expect she will require supervision. Purbright inclined his head slightly. You mean, to ensure that her diligence does not outstrip the bounds of propriety? She smiled, unoffended. Precisely. We cannot have one individual's enthusiasm undermining the collective integrity of the event. Mrs. Glossop tapped her finger against the table. It is remarkable, though, that one might require supervision in order to prevent over-honesty. The room chuckled softly, but the sound carried an undercurrent of unease. Miss Trott, who had remained silent, cleared her throat. There is one point that bears discussion. Last year, as you know, Miss Teal's second ticket was apparently overlooked in the official records. The envelope was found later in the vestry. Might we consider a system to prevent such oversights? A murmur ran around the table. Mrs. Binns's lips pressed together in disapproval. Mrs. Vane's brows lifted ever so slightly. Purbright said, "A simple solution might be a verification sheet signed by at least 2 committee members, noting every ticket and its corresponding donor." Mrs. Vane regarded him with her usual composure. "A sound proposal, Inspector. It appears the committee will require no improvisation in this matter. Diligence, as you say, is essential." The discussion turned to minor details, the placement of tables, the order of stalls, and the etiquette of announcing winners. Even in these matters, the politeness of the participants served as a subtle battleground of authority. Mrs. Glossop, speaking softly but firmly, remarked, "It is remarkable how many consider themselves above reproach in matters of civic duty. Yet we know the truth, do we not?" Mrs. Binns glanced at her sharply. "The truth, Mrs. Glossop, is often inconvenient. We must sometimes rely on discretion." "Discretion," Mrs. Glossop replied, "is a skill, but one easily mistaken for concealment." Purbright sipped his tea, noting the delicate balance of accusation and denial. It was almost an art, he reflected, how Flaxborough managed its moral tensions with the same precision applied to its hedgerows. Toward the end of the meeting, Mrs. Vane addressed the remaining point, the allocation of the miscellaneous prizes. "It is imperative," she said, "that no prize be perceived as favouring one household over another. We must also consider the psychological effect on the wider community. The widow Teal, while generous, must be seen as participating without expectation." Mrs. Binns raised an eyebrow. "Indeed, though one wonders whether generosity can ever be entirely selfless, particularly when the community is so observant." Purbright's pen hovered over his notebook. "Observation is a constant, madam. Some measure it with curiosity, others with suspicion. The results are rarely identical." The room fell silent. Mrs. Glossop tapped the rim of her teacup thoughtfully, and Miss Trott adjusted her spectacles. Even Mrs. Vane, who had orchestrated the meeting with unparalleled composure, allowed a pause for the weight of reflection. As the committee began to disperse, Purbright remained, ostensibly, to offer assistance with minor notes. He observed Mrs. Binns lingering, her gloves folded neatly on the table, eyes fixed on the ledger as if it might reveal confessions unspoken. "Inspector," she said softly, "do you believe Miss Teal's second ticket was deliberately concealed?" Purbright looked up, expression neutral. "It depends on your definition of concealment. If she wished to preserve propriety, it may have been a simple oversight. If she wished to test the integrity of the committee..." He let the sentence hang. She made no reply, only replaced her gloves with meticulous care, and left the room. Once alone, Purbright examined the prize ledger. The missing entries were evident, numbers 19 and 42, corresponding, as far as could be deduced, to tickets purchased by households that had also contributed multiple donations. There was nothing to indicate which was Miss Teal's, yet the second unrecorded prize seemed improbably convenient. He traced the penciled notations, one in a fine, deliberate hand. Check, donor, signature. Beneath it, a faint indentation suggested another line, pressed perhaps in haste or discretion. It was barely legible, yet it whispered of the second ticket. He replaced the ledger and leaned back, considering the committee members' behaviour. Mrs. Vane's calm authority had been the most carefully managed. Mrs. Glossop had balanced accusation and civility. Mrs. Binns had revealed a flicker of apprehension. And Miss Trott, though outwardly detached, had been keenly aware of the inconsistencies. The room, in its quiet, formal order, seemed to hold its breath. Later, in the station, Purbright and Sergeant Love compared their notes. "Sir," said Love, "two missing numbers, but there's a faint smudge on one of the ledger pages. Could be ink from last year, or a new edition." Purbright examined it carefully. "The smudge is consistent with pencil, not accidental. Someone reviewed the entry and erased it from immediate view." "Do you think it was Miss Teal?" "Perhaps. Or someone acting to protect her, or themselves." Love frowned. "Then she didn't conceal it for selfish reasons?" Purbright allowed a faint smile. "Not necessarily. In Flaxborough, self-interest is often polite, invisible, and deferred." He paused, turning the page in the ledger. There, pressed lightly beneath the penciled note, was an indentation, another name. Not fully legible, but enough to suggest intervention. "Sir?" Love said. Purbright's eyes narrowed in measured contemplation. "Someone else knew about the second ticket, and they preferred secrecy to discussion, though..." Words lingered in the lamplight, a subtle accusation without accusation, a shadowed footprint in the garden of propriety. Outside, the evening fog rolled over the rooftops of Flaxborough. The town appeared serene, but beneath the surface, the quiet arithmetic of conscience and advantage continued to balance with impeccable exactitude. Purbright closed the ledger carefully. He allowed the faintest trace of a smile. 2 tickets, 1 widow, and yet there are 3 hands at play. He made a note in his file: observe Mrs. Binns and Mrs. Glossop at next meeting. The second ticket's secret is not yet fully revealed. And with that quiet calculation, the inspector left the empty committee room, leaving behind the scent of tea, polished wood, and unresolved civility. Flaxborough on a Thursday afternoon presented itself as a model of subdued civility. Shutters closed against the sun, hedges trimmed to perfect rectitude, and the occasional dog sniffing politely at corners of propriety. Inspector Purbright had just returned to his office, still reviewing his ledger notes, when the telephone rang with an insistent politeness. "Inspector Purbright," he said, lifting the receiver. "Good afternoon, Inspector," said a voice precise and measured. "This is Miss Teal. I hope I'm not intruding, but I wonder if you might spare a moment to discuss last year's raffle." "Of course," said Purbright, leaning back in his chair. "Come by when convenient." Half an hour later, Flora Teal arrived, immaculate in dress and demeanour, carrying a small notebook. She did not sit until invited, preferring instead to arrange herself with the exactitude of one consulting propriety before convenience. "Inspector," she said softly, "thank you for seeing me. I have reflected on the fete, and I believe there are matters requiring clarification." "Please," Purbright said, gesturing toward the chair opposite. She seated herself and opened her notebook. "It concerns my second ticket, the one unrecorded in the official ledger. I purchased it, as you know, but circumstances prevented me from submitting it in time. At the time, I did not wish to cause scandal or inconvenience. Purbright nodded slowly. I am aware, and yet here we are. Yes, she said, lifting her eyes. I was aware of some anomalies in the prize allocation, though nothing untoward was intended. Still, I felt it my duty to note them in writing, hence the letter to Reverend Vane. I had hoped discretion might preserve the peace, yet I find the ledger incomplete. Discretion, in Flaxborough, is always negotiable, Purbright said mildly. Flora Teal inclined her head. Indeed, I am mindful of that. She hesitated, then added, There is also the matter of the decanter prize, the one from Mrs. Vane. I purchased the second ticket for that prize specifically, though I relinquished any claim to it. My intent was solely to ensure fairness among contributors. And yet the prize remains allocated, Purbright observed. Yes, precisely, she said. Though I wish to understand who might have reviewed the entries, particularly the two missing numbers. Purbright sipped his tea, allowing the pause to underscore its own significance. That is precisely why I wish to speak with you. Someone, at least one person, was aware of your second ticket and opted for silence. Her gaze, calm and controlled, did not falter. Do you suspect impropriety? Not necessarily. The ledger's gaps may reflect prudence rather than fraud, or they may reflect both. She nodded thoughtfully. Flaxborough prudence is often indistinguishable from concealment. For the next hour, the conversation continued in the understated rhythm of subtle accusation and polite confession. Flora Teal recounted her process for acquiring the tickets, recording the donor names, and noting anomalies in the ledger. She spoke with an even-handed morality, highlighting fairness as her guiding principle, yet leaving the impression that she had long anticipated conflict over propriety. You will understand, Inspector, she said finally, closing her notebook with precision, that I did not wish to challenge the authority of the committee. My concern is only that errors be rectified without embarrassment. Errors or secrets, Purbright replied. She allowed a brief, almost imperceptible pause, then said, Perhaps both? The ledger does not reveal the intent behind omissions, only the fact of their occurrence. And yet, Purbright said softly, intent matters in Flaxborough more than the act itself. Flora Teal smiled faintly. I am aware of that truth. It is why I return today, despite prudence advising otherwise. As she rose to leave, Purbright noticed a subtle tension in her posture, a shadow beneath her otherwise immaculate composure. Inspector, she said, one final point. You asked about Mrs. Binns and Mrs. Glossop. I cannot speak to their intentions, but I would observe that even the most courteous of citizens may act from fear or a sense of self-preservation rather than malice. Purbright inclined his head. A valuable observation. Her lips curved ever so slightly. And, Inspector, discretion is sometimes best exercised by the observant rather than the powerful. With that she left, the door clicking behind her with the precise finality of a well-considered departure. Purbright remained alone, turning over in his mind the subtlety of her phrasing, discretion exercised by the observant rather than the powerful. The words suggested not only awareness but also anticipation. Flora Teal had long understood that the second ticket was a delicate instrument in the quiet machinery of reputations. Sergeant Love, arriving later, peered over Purbright's shoulder. She came all this way to say, What exactly? Purbright tapped the ledger. She came to provide clarity. Without disruption, she acknowledged the existence of her second ticket, noted the discrepancies, and left us with the question of who else knew. Love frowned. So the ledger gaps someone covered for her? Perhaps, Purbright said. Or perhaps someone decided discretion was preferable to explanation. Love whistled softly. Flaxborough citizens are full of surprises. Disguised as propriety, Purbright corrected gently. Later that evening, Purbright visited the vicarage. The Reverend was in the drawing-room, polishing his spectacles and glancing nervously at the fire. Mrs. Vane moved silently behind him, arranging books that required no rearrangement. "Inspector," the Reverend said, "I hope you've come to put our minds at rest." "Merely to confirm that Mrs. Vane's admirable discretion remains intact," Purbright said. Mrs. Vane's lips tightened. "It is, as always, and we appreciate your consideration of our peace of mind." Purbright nodded. "You have my assurances, though one must admit that Miss Teal's afternoon call introduced some clarifications." The Reverend blinked. "Clarifications?" "Yes. She confirmed the existence of her second ticket and the intent behind it. Nothing improper, only meticulous honesty." Mrs. Vane inclined her head, expression unreadable. "Meticulous honesty can be trying for those who prefer polite omission." "Indeed," Purbright said mildly. "It tests both memory and conscience." A silence followed, heavy with civility and unspoken calculations. Then Mrs. Vane spoke softly. "We have always acted with propriety. That surely must count for something." "Certainly," Purbright said, "though in Flaxborough, propriety is rarely the same as simplicity." The Reverend coughed, and Mrs. Vane busied herself with an ornamental vase. Purbright stood, nodded, and left, allowing the vicarage to return to its carefully arranged order. Walking back along the high street, Purbright reviewed the day's discoveries. Flora Teal had revealed her second ticket, but had carefully avoided assigning blame or accusation. The ledger's missing numbers suggested intervention, but by whom remained unproven. Mrs. Vane and the Reverend maintained their composure, yet the faintest shadow of apprehension lingered beneath her practised calm. Purbright paused outside the churchyard gate. In the fading light, he observed Miss Teal standing near the lich gate, as if awaiting her own reflection in the town's conscience. She glanced at him briefly and offered the faintest nod, a signal of understanding and tacit cooperation. Her eyes hinted at more than her words had admitted, a vigilance, a readiness, and a patience that could endure unspoken for as long as the town required. Inside his notebook, Purbright made a careful note. Flora Teal confirms ticket. Ledger incomplete. Unknown observer active. Watch Mrs. Binns and Mrs. Glossop. Observe interactions at next. Gathering. Conscience and discretion remain divided. He closed the book and inhaled the evening air, calm but attentive. Flaxborough's quiet streets seemed ordinary, yet the arithmetic of virtue and advantage moved unseen beneath the cobbles. For the first time that day, Purbright allowed himself the faintest smile. The puzzle was far from solved, yet a new clarity had emerged. The second ticket was only the beginning, and its secrets were shared among at least 3 minds, each weighing propriety against discretion. He glanced back at the church. Its windows glimmered in the twilight, revealing nothing of the human calculations within. And in that obscured quiet, he knew the next revelation would arrive neither with announcement nor fanfare, but with the silent precision of observation and subtle conscience. The morning of the summer fade dawned with the kind of soft clarity that Flaxborough regarded as its proper atmosphere, pale sunlight on immaculate hedges, a gentle breeze that threatened neither mischief nor moisture, and the faint, polite chatter of early arrivals. Inspector Purbright walked along the high street, observing each household's preparations with the measured scrutiny of one accustomed to detecting the hidden logic beneath domestic order. Tables were arranged with symmetrical precision, bunting hung at exactly the correct angles, and even the parish notice board had been dusted and aligned. There was, in short, nothing to suggest chaos. Yet Purbright's instincts told him that beneath the civility, calculations of advantage and reputation were already in motion. Mrs. Vane presided over the proceedings with the serene authority of one who believes that virtue is self-evident. She moved among the stalls, directing volunteers with a politeness so carefully measured that it seemed to both command and disarm simultaneously. Mrs. Glossop and Mrs. Binns, equally impeccable, hovered at the edges, supervising yet subtly observing one another, and the public alike. Purbright noted Miss Teal approaching the Raffle stall, her expression calm, yet alert. She carried a small, neatly folded notebook and arranged the tickets with meticulous care. There was no sign of agitation, only an almost imperceptible vigilance, as if she expected the event to unfold as a test of character rather than chance. "Inspector," she said quietly, allowing her eyes to flick to him as he observed, "I have reviewed all the tickets in advance. Each is accounted for to the best of my knowledge." "Except the second ticket," Purbright said mildly, noting the slight catch in her breath, quickly masked by composure. Yes, she admitted. "It is accounted for. I wish to avoid any confusion during the drawing. It was my intention that propriety should remain intact." Purbright inclined his head. "You have performed your role admirably, and yet there are other eyes in play." She glanced discreetly toward Mrs. Binns, who was watching the crowd with sharp attention. "Indeed, I am aware, but discretion, Inspector, often operates best in silence." As the attendees began to arrive, the tension in the air became subtly measurable. Neighbors greeted one another with mild enthusiasm. Gossip was offered in carefully clipped sentences, and the sense of observation was omnipresent. The arithmetic of reputation proceeded quietly. Who would win? Who would donate? Who would notice what? The raffle itself proceeded with the ceremonious gravity of a minor ritual. Purbright observed each ticket drawn and recorded, his attention focused on the numbers corresponding to the missing entries from last year's ledger, 19 and 42. When the first number was announced, murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. When the second was drawn, the slight flicker of recognition passed almost imperceptibly among Mrs. Vane, Mrs. Binns, and Mrs. Glossop. Purbright's notebook, resting on the table, awaited the details. He noticed Miss Teal's calm composure, though her hand rested lightly on the notebook, prepared to intervene if any inconsistency arose. When the second missing number, 42, was called, the winner's name revealed nothing of scandal, a minor contributor with no connection to the widow Teal. The audience cheered politely, none the wiser, while the subtle tension among the committee members did not escape Purbright's observation. After the drawing, Purbright approached the vicarage stall where Mrs. Vane, Mrs. Glossop, and Mrs. Binns were reconciling lists with quiet diligence. "Everything proceeding according to plan?" he asked, in the mildest of tones. "Absolutely," Mrs. Vane replied, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of something between relief and calculation. Mrs. Glossop added, "Transparency is preserved, thanks to careful oversight." "And discretion," Purbright said softly, "remains equally important." Mrs. Binns's lips pressed into a thin line. "One can never be too careful, Inspector. Even the most meticulous records require verification." "Indeed," Purbright agreed, glancing at the ledger still open on the table. "I believe the second ticket has finally found its proper place." Miss Teal, standing nearby, offered the faintest acknowledgment of satisfaction, her eyes suggesting that she had long foreseen this resolution, though she did not indicate to whom or how much it had mattered. Later, as the event settled into the ordinary rhythms of polite festivity, tea poured, scones circulated, small talk exchanged with precise avoidance of controversy, Purbright found a moment to speak privately with Miss Teal. "You handled the second ticket admirably," he said. "No disruption, no undue attention, and yet all accounted for." She nodded, expression calm but reflective. "It was my duty, and perhaps an opportunity to observe character quietly without scandal." "Character is often revealed by what is not said," Purbright observed. "Exactly," she murmured. "Flaxborough teaches one that silence can be more instructive than proclamation." There was a pause, filled by the soft rustle of bunting and the muted hum of polite conversation. "And yet," Purbright continued, "you suspected someone else might be aware of the ticket." "Yes," she admitted. "I anticipated that. Some oversight, some discretion beyond my own, was in play. One does not act alone in matters of conscience." Purbright allowed the remark to sink. There was the faintest implication of another mind, active yet unseen, observing the arithmetic of fairness with its own quiet agenda. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had observed enough to note several subtle interactions, Mrs. Binns occasionally adjusting her gloves with exacting care, Mrs. Glossop scanning the crowd with a mixture of curiosity and judgment, and Miss Teal moving among the stall-holders with meticulous attention. Each acted with propriety, yet each carried the shadow of knowledge unspoken. The second ticket, now properly accounted for, no longer threatened scandal, but it had revealed, through its quiet presence, the soft architecture of ambition and discretion operating in the town. Purbright made a mental note. There were 3 primary actors aware of the ticket: Miss Teal, Mrs. Binns, and Mrs. Glossop. Each had performed their role with polite subtlety, preserving appearances while exercising judgment. As the fete drew to its conventional close, with prizes distributed and citizens politely exhausted, Purbright lingered near the entrance. Miss Teal approached him once more. "Inspector," she said softly, "you may wish to observe one final detail." She indicated Mrs. Binns, who was quietly counting receipts with Mrs. Glossop, their heads bent in the conspiratorial intimacy of shared vigilance. Purbright noted the almost imperceptible exchange, a nod, a tilt of the head, a barely there gesture. It was subtle, unspoken, yet meaningful. Someone was aware, watching, and prepared to act, or refrain, as propriety dictated. "Indeed," he murmured, "observation remains the quietest form of authority." Miss Teal's eyes met his briefly, acknowledging the truth of his statement, and then she departed, folding her notebook with precise care. Returning to the station that evening, Purbright reviewed his notes once more. The second ticket had been revealed, accounted for, and integrated into the formal ledger without incident. Yet the actions of Mrs. Binns and Mrs. Glossop suggested an additional layer. The ticket was not merely a matter of chance, but a test of discretion, an exercise in quiet influence. Sergeant Love peered over his shoulder. "So, sir, everything's sorted then?" "Sort of," Purbright replied, tapping the ledger. "The ticket is resolved, yes, but there remains a question of intent and observation. The arithmetic of virtue is not yet fully revealed." Love frowned. "Meaning, someone's still keeping score?" "Indeed," said Purbright, "and in Flaxborough that score is more important than the prize itself." He wrote a single line in his notebook: "Second ticket accounted, observation ongoing, Mrs. Binns and Mrs. Glossop active, conscience and discretion still in negotiation." Outside, the town settled into its familiar quiet. The sun dipped behind the rooftops, softening the day's light, and the streets seemed ordinary, unremarkable, and polite. Yet Purbright knew better. Beneath the apparent calm, the hidden arithmetic of reputation, advantage, and conscience continued to operate with meticulous care. And in that quiet calculation, the resolution of the second ticket revealed itself not as a scandal avoided, but as a lesson in subtle authority. Each citizen had played a role, each gesture mattered, and the town's moral balance had been preserved, or at least postponed, for another day. Purbright closed his notebook, allowing the faintest trace of a smile. The puzzle, though partially resolved, had revealed its deeper intricacies. The second ticket was not merely a matter of chance or honesty. It was a measure of character observed by those who understood the quiet, unrelenting arithmetic of Flaxborough civility. He extinguished his lamp, confident that while the ticket was accounted for, the silent vigilance of conscience would continue its quiet work through the streets of the town.